As we try to frame this issue, first of all, as we tee it up, I think that you have to see this issue in the context of globalization. And what happens as we experience globalization, where I live in London and where I run a church, we have about 120 people who come to that church with 20 different nationalities in that mix. And when you put 20 different nationalities and that number of people from different cultures together, of course you're going to get disagreements, misunderstandings, miscommunication. That's just part of life and the way that it works. Specifically, of course, around issues which people are passionate about, like religion. The opportunity for misunderstanding is huge in that. Now, it's not just in religion we get misunderstandings. I used to work in marketing, and one of the difficulties that marketeers have as globalization kicks in is to try to make slogans applicable across different cultures, different time zones, things like that. And there've been some noticeable errors along the way. So Electrolux, the Scandinavian manufacturer, was trying to release trying to leave its vacuum cleaner into the US market and came up with this slogan, see if you can spot what's wrong with it. Nothing sucks like an Electrolux. It's good when you think about it, but doesn't quite really work. Vauxhall Nova, the car, trying to release into the South American market and the Spanish markets. They ran with the same name for the car, the Vauxhall Nova, which of course in Spanish means doesn't go, so the car didn't do too well there. And then my personal favourite, and this is all true, you can look it up on the internet, so it must be true unless it's fake news, but that's another issue. Pepsi had a global slogan that was Pepsi Revives. When they tried to translate it into China, they chose the wrong character and actually translated it, Pepsi brings back your ancestors from the dead, which apparently is sold really well, but obviously wasn't quite true. Now look, of course, on one level, extremism is about much more than just communication, but it's certainly not less than communication. And I want us to see this not in the context as a political framework about how do we fight terrorism and extremism in that regard. I don't really have the remit to be talking about that, nor in terms of national security and foreign policy. I want us to see this as a cultural issue as we try to engage with ideas and try to talk to one another and try to work out how we do that and function well in that in a liberal society where you've got lots of people mixing together. Let me start off by looking at extremism and the response to extremism, which is the push for moderation and tolerance, as I'll call it, the push for moderation and tolerance. Eboo Patel, the previous US government advisor for the previous administration on faith matters, said in an ABC News talk show that he said, the role religion is going to play in the 21st century is going to either be a barrier of division, a bomb of destruction, or a bridge of cooperation. Our job, and he meant collectively as a society, our job is to make it a bridge of cooperation. You get that? A bomb of destruction, a barrier of division, or a bridge of cooperation. Our job is to make it a bridge of cooperation. Now, the question is, how do we do that? Well, there are two competing trends going on in society that some sociologists of religion have picked up on, particularly. The most famous person who's picked up on this one, the foremost sociologist of religion, called Professor Grace Davey. She's based down at Exeter University, and she's written an excellent book called The Paradox of Religion in Britain that's now out in Volume 2, The Persistent Paradox of Religion in Britain. There you go, we're still in paradox. And what she points to is that on one hand, we've got an increasing process of secularization going on, the slow, steady march of secularization, particularly in terms of the concepts and the ideas that we engage with in the public square. And on the other hand, we are having a growth in the amount of need for engagement in religion. So there's more and more religion in the newspapers, there's more and more religion in public discussion, often around extremism and terrorism, but it's just there. You can do things that you can measure that by word counts in newspapers, by frequency of discussion, but it's being talked about more. Now she says this, at precisely the moment when they are most needed, British and Western people are losing the vocabulary, tools and concepts that they require to have constructive conversations about faith. In other words, as we're more and more secularized, we lack the tools to be able to engage with religion, but we need those tools to engage with religion. And so we've got a real problem, she says. And there's an inadequate response, which again she traces, which has been to, I suppose, to moderate and to try to enforce tolerance. And I want you to see that it's inadequate, but let's first look at the response. Now, even in the name extremism, you see what's going on there, because that is actually a relatively new term to describe a particular part of religious engagement. The Cambridge Dictionary defines extremism as the fact of someone having beliefs that most people think are unreasonable and unacceptable. Notice that, unreasonable and unacceptable to most people, to the majority. The Oxford English Dictionary says it's the holding of extreme political or religious views or fanaticism. So this issue of extremism is about unreasonableness, is about unacceptability, is about really holding a view with great zeal, with an extreme passion. So under this view, what you need to aim for is you need to aim for moderation, everything in moderation, right? As your mum and dad might have told you before you came up to university. Now, legally, this has led to things like the Section 5 Public Order Act. Now, listen to the phrasing of this, where a person is guilty of an offence for something as vague as, and I quote, threatening, abusive, insulting behaviour within the hearing or sight of a person likely to be caused harassment, alarm, or distress thereby. That has led to, and you'll be aware of this, things like trigger warnings, safe spaces, no platforming, all that type of stuff, right? And so, you can take the extreme examples, but actually notice, just as we kind of get into that, if you perceive it as it causes you harassment, alarm, or distress, then it can be classified as extremism. Well, that's quite subjective, isn't it? For a law. And so it's led to situations like an Oxford student arrested in 2005 for saying, "Excuse me, officer, he was drunk. Excuse me, officer, I think your horse is gay." Now, that's a stupid thing to say. It's an offensive thing to say to someone who has homosexual desires. Is it worthy of arrest? 16-year-old arrested for a placard, "Scientology is a dangerous cult." You might well say, I think that should be up for debate. Is it a cult? Is it a dangerous cult? Well, surely you want to examine that, right? But arrested for it, a 16-year-old. And these aren't isolated incidents. This is the cultural framework we're in. Anything that's not moderate, anything that's not considered tolerant, that's unreasonable or can cause distress to another person, could be arrested for, which massively shrinks the public discourse. Now, I want you to see why moderation and tolerance, whilst understandable responses, I think are unacceptable responses. Partly that's an appeal to history. That's not the British way. It's not been the British way of the history of John Stuart Mill and the engagement in the marketplace of ideas and the robust debate. And partly it's not actually going to combat extremism. It's naive about the way that extremism works. Let me just first of all put to you that moderation is not always a good thing. For example, let me give you a really trivial response. If I was telling you that I loved my wife and you said, "How much do you love her?" and I said, "Moderately," do you think that would thrill her? My point is now, love is a virtue. Are all virtues to be pursued in moderation? How much do you, if you'd asked Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he was fighting, the gulags and Stalin on the issue of truth, and you said, "How passionate are you about truth?" "Moderately passionate about truth." Moderately. Is that going to cut it? You see, some values you don't want to be moderate about. William Wilberforce, the abolition of slavery, he was not moderate in his view that it was evil and wrong. In fact, had he been moderate, he would not have been able to fight it over the length of the course that he had to fight it for, and with the tenacity that he had to fight it for. In fact, go back to some of our definitions. Cause harassment, alarm, or distress. Many people said at the time that his views were unreasonable to the masses, unacceptable to the masses, and caused people distress because they could, in fact, impinge upon major parts of the economy. Would he have overturned slavery? Had we had this view? He could have even been arrested for it. I'm not caricaturing, right? The law's there. You do the maths. You're all bright. You see, I think it's an entirely inadequate response. There are some things it's worthwhile being extreme about, worthwhile being fierce and passionate about. Truth, love, the value of another human being. We need to fight those things in the right way, as we'll come to in a moment. But is moderation really such a great virtue? Secondly, I think it's naive about how we're actually going to fight extremism or terrorism. You see, we have to realize, and an excellent book I recommend to you is a book called The Islamist, written by Ed Hussein, who himself was radicalized in East London, just down the road, 10 minutes away from where I minister in London. And in the book, he writes about the process of his radicalization, and then he was brought back from the brink, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. But what's really interesting is the appeal that the recruiters to terrorism made to him was about values, was about something to live for, was about something to fight for. In other words, into a cultural vacuum where he had not much to live for, they gave him a positive vision. Now, it's a distorted vision. Ultimately, I think it's an evil vision. But it was a vision nonetheless. How are we going to fight that vision? Interestingly, in the book, the thing that brings him back from the edge is falling in love. Isn't that interesting? The positive virtue of love is what brings him back away from extremism as he falls in love. So what is our great British solution to try to fight extremism and the vision that is being placed before young men and women who are disaffected with Western society? You know what it is. Moderation. Well, that's not a value that anyone wants to live and die for. I mean, that's a kind of an absence of a value. Tolerance. I mean, again, tolerance is not really a virtue. It's more the absence of virtue. So if I invite you around for dinner and I say to you, how did you find my cooking? And you said, it was tolerable. How was the conversation? I tolerated it. I mean, you're not saying much positive. In fact, you're damning me with faint praise. It's not exactly something that gets you up in the morning. I want to be a moderate and tolerant human being. You see, the problem is it's more of the absence of virtue. It's more about moderating virtues and actually pitching a positive vision for life. And this is why, and the government know this is why they're trying to reclaim British values. The problem is they're not going back to British history to really reclaim the right ones. So some we want to say amen to, like democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty. Those are things we should be passionate about. But mutual respect and tolerance, that is a low bar, my friends, a low bar. We need to do much better than that. You see, it won't actually pitch a positive vision to those who might be radicalized. It doesn't deal with the issue. So you'll say, go on then, what's your alternative? Let me give you the alternative. First of all, I think we need to diagnose the problem. The problem is not holding a view too passionately. That is not the problem. The problem is the views that are held passionately, but not holding a view too passionately. Do you get the difference? So moderating all views doesn't deal with the problem. It's like a sledgehammer to crack a nut. First of all, we need to realize there is a tendency to absolutize something in such a way that it overrides the individual, and this is the problem. Let me say that again. There is a tendency to absolutize certain values in a way that overrides the good and the integrity of the individual, and that is a problem. Let me show it through history. Communism. Communism took the truth of the commune, the collective, and when it went wrong, particularly, it absolutized it so that you could trample over any freedom, any individual to protect the commune. And that was when the huge abuses started to happen. You absolutize a value at the expense of individuals, you've got a problem. Islamism right now. What's the problem with it? Well, it's taken the truth about the establishment of the State of Islam and people converting to and following Allah, and it's absolutized it so that anything can be justified in the pursuit of those two aims. You can trample over any individual, forced conversions, suicide bombing. Anything can be done because those things are so important. So when you absolutize certain values at the expense of individuals, you've got a huge problem. Secularism, gone wrong. When it absolutizes secularism and you say anything can be justified in the pursuit of secularism, such that it tramples on religious freedoms or individuals, you get huge problems. Look at Pol Pot's Cambodia. Look at Stalin's Russia. It's been done in history. So you take a virtue, you absolutize it, and you say anything can be justified in its pursuit, you've got a problem. And the Bible has a word for that in the religious domain, it's called idolatry. It means you take a good thing, you make it an ultimate thing, at the expense of individuals. Effectively, you make it a God thing. You give it the authority of God. Anything can be justified in its pursuit, and then you've got a problem. So we need to properly diagnose the problem. Now, what's the solution to that? Well, the Bible's solution, I want you to look at this and I want you to inhabit it for a moment and see whether you think it would help. The Bible's solution is the person of Jesus Christ. And in his person, he perfectly exhibits at least two virtues that I want to focus on. Grace and truth. Let me read, and you can follow it here if you want on page 4, but it's a short verse, so if you don't want to, there's no problem. But chapter 1, verse 14, often read around Christmas time, but listen to this. The Word, that is Jesus Christ, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. I want to pitch to you that hold these two values together that are embodied in the person and work and life and death of Jesus Christ, grace and truth, and you'll see something unique happening in society. It enables us to engage, but also enables us to navigate our way in these difficult issues. Now, first of all, grace. Let me just say, grace is not being nice, okay? Don't do that to grace. Often people talk about grace, they say, oh, Christians are very gracious, they're nice people. Or maybe you don't think they are, but either way, sometimes grace is diminished down to niceness. Years ago, Harry Enfield, the comedian, had this character called Tim Nice But Dim, right? He was kind of this posh, like university graduate who was like, dim, as it says, and constantly got himself into a mess, and was nice, and he was just a jolly nice bloke. That is not what grace means. It doesn't mean being a jolly nice bloke. Grace has got much more of an edge to it than that. Grace is about this. Grace says every individual and human being could not be more valuable to the Creator God. In fact, every human being and every individual is so valuable that God is prepared to sacrifice that which is most costly to save them. And that is his Son. This is the message of Christianity. It's why it's a message of grace. It says that God sends his Son into the world to die for people because they are so valuable to the Creator that he wants to do everything possible to save them. And therefore, that means that every human being in this room and in any other room in the world has infinite worth. Because an infinite price, the price of his own Son, has been paid for them. And that has always been the Christian root of democracy. Because it says, I love you and see through grace you have enough dignity and value that nothing overrides you as a human being. You should never be sacrificed. Now notice the complete difference here. This is not saying we sacrifice human beings for the sake of a goal. This is saying anything can be sacrificed for human beings. Right? In other words, people are so important to God, he will sacrifice anything and everything, especially his Son, for their sake. Now, when you get that, it radically changes your conversation, because when I'm conversing with you, I see you as a person of infinite worth, of value and dignity. You might be wrong, human beings often are, right? But it doesn't mean that anything can be justified to override you. No, it means I respect you, I want to hear your view, I want to listen to your view. It's precisely because you're valuable, I think your view has merit. That's grace. And that has been the Christian root of democracy and liberal debate. I respect you, I want to hear your opinion. I respect you enough also to recognize you might well be wrong, because I'm often wrong. So we're going to talk, we're going to listen, we're going to engage with each other, we're going to engage on that level. That's grace. In fact, you see it brilliantly. I don't know if you've seen the film Hacksaw Ridge with Desmond Doss. A committed Christian, he's on trial at the beginning when he wants to enlist because he won't obey his commanding officer's command to take up arms. And he says this when he's asked why he wants to enlist. He says, I had a job in a defense plant and I couldn't have taken a deferment. That ain't right. Sorry, I could have taken a deferment, but that ain't right. It ain't right that other men should fight and die, that I would just be sitting at home safe. I need to serve others. I got the energy and the passion to serve as a medic right in the middle with the other guys. No less danger. Just while everybody else is taking life, I'm going to be saving it. With the world so set on tearing itself apart, it doesn't seem like such a bad thing to me to want to put a little bit of it back together. As he runs onto the battlefield, true story, without any guns, and starts saving lives, dragging them off the battlefield. He sacrifices himself for other people. That's grace. And this is what motivates a unique way that Jesus treats people. Have you ever wondered when you read the New Testament why it is that the outcasts run to him, that the socially ostracized and put down love him? Because of grace. Because everything about him is grace, saying you're valuable, you're a person, come to me, I want to hear you, I want to love you, I want to know you. But grace with truth. Grace balanced with truth. Truth is with a capital T. Let me say this, in liberal society, of course you can be wrong. Of course you can be passionate about something and believe it really strongly and be wrong. Human beings are wrong all the time, which is why we need to debate truth, not downplay truth. That's not the way to deal with being wrong. We need grace that says you are valuable, and we need truth that says you are valuable enough that I'm going to debate and see whether what you're saying is true. And so let's have the debate. And even if you hold the view extremely, well, let's debate it. William Wilberforce, I mentioned him at the beginning, fascinating. Towards the end of his life, after having debated for many years that slavery should be abolished, he fought tooth and nail, but he never responded by demonizing his opponents. In fact, there's a little-known detail which is wonderful. When one of his main opponents, who had attacked him and done him most damage, publicly died, Wilberforce made private arrangements for his widow to be properly cared for out of his own expense. Now that is grace. And yet it was in the context of a fierce fight for truth. And living like that is what will change society. And I put it to you that those are the type of values we should be fighting for, but not doing harm to other people. No, fighting by serving other people so we see them at work. So there's a positive vision that could grip people, and I believe is the society we should be seeking to shape. I'd love to know what you think. I'm going to pause there. And why don't you turn to the person next to you now, buzz for a couple of minutes about maybe what it is you think I said that you disagree with or you might agree with, and any questions you've got. Text those questions in, and then V will come up in a moment and take questions from you.
Sorry to break into your discussions, but we're going to have a chance for questions now. We've got some texted in, so I can go straight to them, unless someone would like to ask a question from the floor, so there'll be a mic going round. So if you'd like to ask a question from the floor, just stick up a hand and you can ask straight away. Okay, we'll go with one from texted in. So, if humans are infinitely valuable, doesn't that tend to idolize humans?
Very clever. No, it doesn't, because humans don't have that value in and of themselves. This is part of what it means to be made in the image of God. So our value is not something that we have in and of ourselves. It's a value conferred on us in relationship to our Creator and our Redeemer. So he is the one who has infinite value, and he confers that onto us by creating us, loving enough to creating us in his image. That's why that doctrine is so important. And also by redeeming us. And by the way, that's why it's so important that, we can make lovely liberal creeds about, all people are equal, all people have great value. The question is, where do you get that from? I mean, if it's just randomness and we're just in a universe of random chance, why, for example, is one species more valuable than another? Or why are all species equally valuable? Or why is one race more valuable than another? Interestingly, as a point of historical fact, Darwin believed that white people were more valued than black people on the basis of, his own particular doctrine. That was how he worked it out. Now, I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that means you reject Darwinism. I'm just saying, where do you get your doctrine of value from? Human beings have value in relationship to a God who is of infinite value, and therefore it's conferred on them. So they're not idolized, but rather they do have that huge and estimable value in connection to him. But he's the one with infinite worth. So he's the only God in the universe.
Would anyone like to come back on that question? Okay.
I can hear you, so I can repeat it if needs be.
Couldn't you also argue then that liberalism is also from God, and therefore you're not actually idolizing liberalism?
So I'm not sure I get your logical link. If liberalism is from God, why not?
As in, the value of liberalism is not intrinsic, but it's extrinsic.
Oh, I
because
see.
That's your argument as to why humans are not idols.
Yeah, I think what I would say is that values are not given, are not conferred on them the image of God, and they're not redeemed in the same way that human beings are. But equally, it's not so much whether, I don't think those values in and of themselves have an infinite value anyway. I think it's more the way that human beings treat them. So it's a tendency in the human heart, and a distorted tendency in the human heart, to not recognize the one thing in the universe, or the one person in the universe who does have ultimate worth, God, and by not doing that, to treat other things as God's substitutes. And values are, things we do, materialism, liberalism could be, secularism, could be your career, could be another person. We treat those things as God's substitutes, and we load into them a value they can't bear. So that's the problem. So I agree with you, they don't have that value, but it's part of the distorted tendency of human beings to give them that value, and that's when things go wrong.
Great. So another question, isn't tolerance an absence of vice rather than an absence of virtue?
No, I don't think tolerance is an absence of vice. As I said, I think tolerance is a way to moderate certain vices. I don't think it's an absence of vice. If you find a perfectly tolerant person, would you say that they have no vices? Well, again, I don't think that tolerance speaks to, for example, the passion of love. I don't think tolerance speaks to, for example, a pursuit of excellence necessarily. I think tolerance has nothing to say about those things. And so, for example, consider an athlete who's got to pursue excellence. What has tolerance got to say to them? I don't think it speaks into that situation. So I don't think it is therefore as a value itself. I don't think it's extensive enough. I don't think it's deep enough. I don't think it's rich enough to be able to really speak into life as it's needed. I think grace and truth do. You might want to come back on me, but I don't think it does.
Yeah, anyone want to come back on that? Happy with that?
No, not for it to be a virtue. Sorry, I wasn't being clear. No, I'm not saying that for anything to be a virtue has to apply to all facets of life. In the debate about tolerance, we're saying, is it sufficient for tolerance to marshal the public square? And to speak of that, and I was saying rather tolerance itself is not a sufficient virtue to do that. So I'm arguing about its insufficiency in one realm. I'm also saying I don't really think, properly speaking, it's Is it a virtue, tolerance? If it is a virtue, it's a particular type of virtue that functions by moderating other things down. And so, in that sense, I'd want to debate about whether it's actually a good virtue or even a virtue at all. But that's a kind of philosophical debate. But I just don't think it's a very good virtue if it is. Sorry, not for being clear. Thank you.
Great. So why is it only through the Christian faith that society can adopt the values of grace and truth?
Because I think it raises the question, if you take my understanding of, of the biblical doctrine of grace about being the conference of value on human beings of an infinite worth because of their relationship to their Creator and their Redeemer, my question to anyone would be, where do you get that value on human beings from? That's the question, right? I mean, you can say, it's a nice thing, of course, for everyone to say, I value all people, I treat them all with equal... Yeah, but that's got to be robust, it's got to stand up to scrutiny. Where does that come from? Where do people get their value from? I mean, isn't it demonstrably absurd that we have value if we're in a valueless universe? I mean, you can't make value out of nothing, right? I mean, I know bankers try in London, but you can't do it. And when you do, you get slapped on the wrist. So where does that value come from? And I'm not saying that Christianity is the only religion or only philosophical system that is claiming to be able that human beings have value. I would say it's the only consistent one that actually stands up to robust scrutiny. Now, you may want to come back to me on that. That's fine. I certainly think that secularism is an easy one to knock out the room. I don't see where secular value for human beings in secularism comes from. Because if there is nothingness, and if we're in a meaningless and nothingness universe, where does the value come from? It's just a mental exercise to say you've got value, but I could equally mentally exercise say you don't have value, and you can't disagree with me. I mean, where's the benchmark? You might say, well, other religions, but other religions don't have the same doctrine of redemption. What has been sacrificed in other religions for human beings that has conferred on them such a great value? Sacrifice of that type, redemption of that type is unique to Christianity. I'm happy for the pushback. I'm just, pitching it out there, and sometimes I say it that way so that hopefully it provokes a response, but happy for the pushback if you've got one.
Any pushbacks on that? Yeah, just here.
How do you balance the grace of work and being extremists against the work of people they might harm or hurt?
Great question. How do you balance the grace and worth of an extremist against the grace and the worth of the people that they might harm? Yeah, well, that's kind of getting into your particular view of morality, but I think the behind that question is a kind of consequentialist morality. The saying that what we need to do is we need to kind of weigh up, the maximum good. But of course, that's a bit difficult. If everyone's got infinite value, then the worth of one person, and the worth of the many actually is, infinite, right? Mathematicians, you can correct me on that. Infinity plus infinity is infinity. So that's quite difficult, which is interestingly why Christianity is not primarily a consequentialist ethical framework. It's a deontological, technically, which means that actually God says the way that things should be and the way things are, and he gives us that moral framework to live within, and we do the right thing, and we trust him with the consequences, primarily. So it means we don't necessarily need to get into, but of course that doesn't mean that we don't stand up to, a terrorist. It just means that we don't do so in such a way that says, and demonizes them and says they're of no value, or we can just easily sacrifice them because of the choices they've made in life. So it balances it. We love them, and we would sacrifice ourselves maybe for them, interestingly, which is the doctrine in Christianity of love your enemies.
So why is it that only humans have infinite value? Surely there are other things of immense value, such as the planet we live on.
Great question. Yes, thank you. And Christ's redemption does extend to all of creation in that sense, but properly speaking, within the Christian theological framework, Christ's death is for the people that he created and now the people that he's redeeming. And so it extends to and involves, because human beings rule over all aspects of creation, but properly speaking, the only thing in the universe that is made in the image of God and that is redeemed in that way by the image being remade is human beings. So other things have a subsidiary value. And now you can see where, the kind of Christian moral order comes in. A human being has more value than an animal. An animal, within the Christian framework has more value than a plant. And this is where the legal framework kicks in, right? You stamp on a plant, you might be told off for, walking on the grass. You stamp on an animal, RSPCA might be called. You stamp on a human being, you're going to be on trial for murder. You see the value hierarchy? You see that's the way it works. And that's interesting, the legal system we've inherited from a Christian past. So there's a framework of values within it, but human beings are at the top under God. There's a Christian moral order there and moral legal framework that works. I personally think it's got a beauty to it and an order to it, but also a flexibility within it to accommodate and debate in the public square. But we'll see.
Great. Would anyone like to respond to that? No? Any other questions from the floor? You just want to wait for the mic so everyone can hear. That'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, in your talk you were talking about like government policy of pushing through kind of British values and stuff like that, and I noticed that you kind of probably rightly so criticised that policy, but I was wondering, like, practically speaking, if we did then embrace these values of grace and truth, like, how does that map onto government policy, like practical things we can actually be doing as a society to combat the problem? Because obviously it's a great philosophy, but then how does it work itself out?
Yeah, really good question. Thank you. Look, I'm not a policy maker, so I'm probably getting well beyond my area of expertise here, so this may be weak as water, so I'll say that up front. Look, the type of things that one would like to see in a community is not stifling debate simply because someone holds what is deemed an extreme view. I think you would want to see, and I do think the harm principle is very helpful, which is trying to work out whether there is an intention for harm in that particular view. That has often been an extension of a Christian liberal system, which is once I express a view that very obviously in it is intended to do harm in its effect, then it might be, because again, the right for the freedom of expression or the freedom of religion is not an absolute. Yeah? So therefore it's of a relative value, and we've got to balance these things. And if in my freedom of expression or freedom of religion I intend to do harm to another person, I might forfeit that value because the value of the human being is such that at that moment, that other value, overrides it. So you can see again how the moral hierarchy kicks in. But I would certainly want to see a much freer debate, much less people hiding behind "it offended me." It offended my sensibilities. I felt a little bit stressed by it. Of course, you want to love people enough to take that seriously and to provide support to people. But I think a lot of that can be a hiding behind. There's a brilliant, kind of social philosopher called Jamie White. He's a Kiwi. He straight talks on these things, and he particularly goes to town on the view of when people hide behind, well, it's my right to an opinion. He says that's just a non-argument. Your right to an opinion is not up for debate. The very fact you're having the debate means I've assumed your right to an opinion. So stop hiding. Let's debate. And I think that type of robust but gracious listening to other people saying, I want to hear your opinion, would be great. And also it would play into the issues of, I think, practical one around social media, because one of the problems with social media is in a preference orientation on social media, it only pushes to me the views I want to hear. Well, if I really take grace seriously, I want to hear opposite views so I can properly value people and listen to it. And I will try to make your case for you stronger than you would make it because I love you enough to value you. So I will do your opinion the best possible case rather than caricaturing it, because if it's true, it should stand up to scrutiny. So there's a charity, Christian virtues like charity flow out of this, of the way I treat other people. And I think those are positive values which really start to infuse and give lifeblood to a society. So I'd want to see some of those things, but it might be weak as water, as I said.
Great, thank you so much. That's all we've got time for, but
Thanks,
can we say a big thank you to Pete. And if you've got time, if you don't need to rush off, you're really welcome to stay. So there'll be some snacks coming out to you on your tables. We'd love for you to be able to carry on those conversations from earlier. And as Pete said, he will be hanging around, and he'd be really keen to keep chatting to you if you want to discuss anything more from what he's been saying. On your way out, you'll see a table with some books on it that will help you think more about this and other topics. So a particular one to highlight in this kind of context of tolerance and extremism is this one. So The Arrogance of Christianity. Is Jesus the Only Way? So these are free for you to take away. Would really love for you to make use of them if that would be helpful for you. And on your tables, you'll see flyers for big questions for the rest of term. Grab one of those. We'd love to see you here again next week. And also on your tables, you'll see some response cards, some feedback. We'd love to hear how you found today, things you enjoyed, things you didn't enjoy. And if you'd want to chat more about anything you've heard today or anything else, just tick the I'm interested box and someone from the Christian Union will get in touch with you. That's all from me. Thanks so much again for coming, and have a lovely afternoon.